Hello, I will be talking about the negative externalities of production that construction has. Specifically, I will be talking about this set of apartments that are near my house, and since I've lived through those negative externalities myself, I will be telling you about them and I will be analyzing them from an economic perspective. For comparison, here's the size of my apartment, and these are the sizes of the new apartments they built near ours. These are over 30 floors tall, and as you can see from the surroundings, there are no apartments here that are nearly that tall. Our apartment there is 9 floors. This one is also 9 floors, but the government somehow gave special permission for them to build this high. To understand what externalities mean, first we have to understand the concepts of marginal cost and marginal benefit. So marginal cost is the change in the total cost of production that comes from producing one extra unit of a product. And similarly, marginal benefit is the amount of utility or satisfaction that a consumer gets from consuming one extra unit of a product. In order to graphically represent our marginal costs and marginal benefits, we can use our regular supply and demand graph, but instead of using price as the y-axis, we can instead put the costs and benefits of production and consumption onto the y-axis. The amount a producer is willing to supply is dependent on the cost of production. For example, if something costs $1 million to produce, that producer will not sell it for less than $1 million because they won't make a profit that way. Therefore, we can replace our supply curve with our marginal private cost, or the cost that the producer pays to produce a good. Similarly, the demand is dependent on the benefit that a consumer will get from buying a product. If a consumer is not going to benefit from a product, then they have no reason to buy that product. We're assuming that the consumers are rational economic actors here, meaning that they are not going to buy something that they have no use for. So we can replace our demand curve with our marginal private benefit, or the benefit that the consumer buying the product gets from that product. Now that we have our cost and benefit curves, we can consider our equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. At the point where our private costs of production are equal to our private benefits of consumption, which is point A, a QE amount of the product is consumed, and it has a price of PE. This is the free market equilibrium price. However, the equilibrium quantity of a product is not always the socially optimal quantity of that product to be produced. This is because sometimes there are externalities of production, which means there are extra costs of production that are paid by someone else other than the producer. Now, the producer doesn't care about these costs because when doing their profit calculations, they only care about the costs that they have to pay personally. However, these costs are still paid by society at large. Therefore, they have to be accounted for in some way. They can be represented by plotting another curve above the marginal private cost curve called the marginal social cost. The marginal social cost is defined as the cost of producing a product that is paid by the entirety of society, not just the producer. Therefore, the MSC is equal to the marginal private cost plus the negative externalities of production. The negative externalities being costs that are paid by people unrelated to the transaction or third parties. So the externality is equal to the gap between the MSC and the MPC because it's equal to their difference. And as you can see here, the MSC intersects the marginal private benefit at a completely different point than the MPC does. This new point, point B, will be our socially optimal equilibrium point. As you can see, when a negative externality exists, QO, the socially optimal quantity of a good, is less than the equilibrium quantity of that good. Society in a free market would produce more of that good than they should. This means there's an overproduction of that good by amount QOQE. The overproduction of this good creates a deadweight loss equal to the area of the blue triangle shown. Now let's analyze why the buildings I showed previously exert negative externalities of production. Well, first of all, the construction itself actually has a lot of costs that are not paid by the construction company. So the main one would be noise pollution. These buildings were built over the span of 2 years, from 2020 to 2022. And during that time, everyone was at home during the pandemic, but they would be doing construction from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. every day, and everyone would have to live with all the noise of construction for 2 years straight. Other than the noise, the construction also caused a lot of traffic because there would be trucks and bulldozers and all sorts of industrial vehicles constantly moving on a road that is not designed to handle them. And they would also pollute the environment and cause a lot of dust and construction materials to spill over onto the streets. It is also important to note that the externalities still exist even after the construction is completed. This is because these are apartments and people live in those apartments and people need electricity, water, and roads. But the existing infrastructure in this neighborhood is not designed to fulfill the needs of that many people, so the government will have to provide more resources to this area. This, of course, has costs of providing those resources that are paid by the government, but also during roadworks and waterworks and changes to the electricity lines, they cause noise pollution and they cause all the problems of construction that were mentioned previously. As you can see here, for the past few weeks, there has been road work going on near our house. Not only does this make the area look bad, it also increases traffic and causes other sorts of problems. As the government tries to provide more resources to this area, they have to change the existing infrastructure, and that causes electricity cuts and water cuts and all sorts of problems. So, for the past few months, we've had multiple days where the electricity was gone for more than a few hours. We've had one day where there was no water, and we've had a period of a few days where we had no Wi-Fi because they were changing the Wi-Fi cables under the roads. So I found my mobile data usage from October, as you can see here. There's a massive spike there on that day where the internet was gone. And I had to pay for that extra mobile data I used, even though we normally have a infinite Wi-Fi subscription. We don't have an unlimited data plan on mobile data. So that extra cost was paid by me. So that's a measurable negative externality of those apartments that has been directly paid by me. And similarly, one day there was an econ essay due on Friday, if you remember. But when I came home, there was no electricity, and I had no device that had battery in it. So I had to ask Mr. George for an extension on my essay, as you can see here. This caused me to lose an entire day of productivity because I was just waiting at home for the electricity to come back, and I had no idea when it would come back. In addition, the existence of very tall buildings next to buildings that are much shorter ruins the views of those other buildings and therefore makes the prices of those buildings decrease. Here's the view from my room. As you can see, it's entirely covered by those new apartments. Now, a possible solution would be to impose a tax on tall buildings, but that wouldn't really be an ideal solution because there would still be companies that are willing to pay that tax and still produce tall buildings in areas where they can't be maintained by the government. So instead, what the government can do is create zoning laws that set a hard limit on the amount of floors a building can have. This doesn't have the problem of a black market because nobody can secretly make a 30-story tall apartment. The government can just see you and tear it down. These laws have actually existed in Ankara for a while. However, when the government had ties to the companies that produced apartments, they relaxed those laws and let them go over the limits in certain areas. So the government chose to ignore the negative externality in order to increase the quantity from the socially optimal quantity to the market equilibrium quantity. They did not look out for the best interests of society. However, under the new Ankara government, those laws have been put back into place, and 31-story tall buildings in places like these are not allowed anymore. To conclude, the construction of excessively tall buildings in residential areas unfit for their construction create external costs that are paid by other people living around that area,
who don't have anything to do with living in that house or constructing that house. They also cause taxpayer dollars to be wasted. Therefore, the government can impose hard limits on the amount of floors buildings can have in order to prevent these negative externalities from occurring.